right? Because have you driven a GT40? Have you met that thing from your childhood?
I have driven a GT40 as well. Not enough. Just like I would say, I've driven a McLaren F1. Not enough.
Operators are standing by. Call if you want to make that happen for Ross. Ross is here and willing to help.
That was a moment in time I was like, if we could just put some tire warmers on here now and I could just go and stand on it and throw it around these twisty little bits through this park, that would be way cool.
It's got a seat on each side and you're sitting there and the airbox goes over your head and that big, intake honk.
I'll look at an F1 and go, that's a really special tool.
That's what they called me in college, a really special tool.
If I walked up to Gordon Murray today, I'd go, hey, thanks. Like, that was an amazing experience. Did I make it clear that I haven't driven it enough?
Hi, it's Sam. This, right now, is a commercial for the podcast that you're already listening to. Is that weird? I don't know. Podcasts are weird. We have this thing called Patreon. You go there, and for a few bucks a month, you get to help support the show, but you also get neat perks like speed secret stuff from Ross and rad ways to dive deeper into the stuff we talk about here. The money we raise through Patreon goes toward keeping the show on the air. It also goes toward paying our producer, Mike, and kibble and shoelaces and whatever the hell else really nice Californians eat when they're not editing podcasts. Should you spend your $5 on this if you have $5 to spare? Well, it would make us happy, but we're not the boss of you, and that's okay. We're just glad you're listening, Thanks. Back to the show. Hi, hey, Ross. It's not the car, except today we're going to do something we call It Is the Car, which may not make any sense because the title of the show is the title of the show, but this is a chance to talk about the sheet metal without talking about the sheet metal. It's a chance to go down the road of why the machinery matters and why, at the end of the day, for race drivers and for a lot of people on the road too, cars are just a tool, but that doesn't mean that they don't mean so much more. So today we're going to talk about the McLaren F1, which is probably the single most A-list name in hypercars and sports cars and supercars that you could come up with for anybody under the age of 90 at this point. Ross, what's that mean to you? The McLaren F1, right?
Well, being barely under the age of 90, the F1, that car, when I was a kid, I had posters of cars on my wall. I had all sorts of car photos. If that car was around when I was a kid, that would have been the star attraction. That would have been the biggest poster on my wall because of what it did, what it looked like, what it meant, what it was. All of that stuff. I mean, it was the ultimate.
So that's the interesting thing, right? So it helps here to kind of nail in the nut graph of the thing, the nail in the basics, right? What we're dealing with. We're dealing with this is a machine that was simultaneously the peak of a certain kind of story, the peak of a certain kind of blueprint for fast cars, the peak of a certain kind of engineering in the 20th century. And it went out and did some pretty amazing stuff with a really simple recipe. So early 90s, V12, mid-engined, carbon fiber tub built by McLaren, which, as most of you probably know, as Ross knows, as our producer knows, everybody knows McLaren as the Formula One team. It started out as one guy, right? Bruce McLaren, racing driver, founds his own shop, starts building cars. He's from New Zealand, dies in an accident, and then the company goes on. And then by the early 90s, they had gotten to a point where they had a raft of Formula One championships, and like a lot of successful racing constructors, they wanted to get into road cars. And they chose to do this in a unique way. The way they went and did it, they took one of the most successful Formula One designers, one of the most successful racing car designers in history, one of the most imaginative, a guy named Gordon Murray, and basically gave him a blank sheet of paper. And not just a blank sheet of paper, but a blank sheet of paper with no rules on it. And a blank sheet of paper, not just with no rules, but with no price tag. The car that resulted. And at that point, you have to remember, right, that This has happened before. 9 times out of 10, when car companies spit out, or when somebody gives a designer or an engineer an endless recipe with no price on it, half the time, quarter of the time, that results in a car. And a quarter of that time, that car actually sells, people actually buy it, it enters the world. And then maybe a fraction of that time, you end up with something that matters, that goes on and does things. Well, the McLaren was this kind of moonshot thing. It weighed 2,400 pounds dry. They built 100 of them. It cost $1 million at a time when most supercars were $400,000, $500,000, $600,000. Ended up being the fastest production car on Earth. It went 231 miles an hour in stock trim at a time when most Ferraris would struggle to top 200 or even hit it, right? And there's gobs to the story. We don't have time to get into it today. There are 1,000 little pieces of trivia, and our producer would stab me in the neck with a pen if I went down the road of reading all of them, which I want to do. But the bigger point is that this thing meant something. And in that period, when it came out, I was in middle school. And Ross, you were, if you're almost 90, that means you were probably, 50 at that time? 60?
In a retirement home, yeah. I was in a retirement home, yeah.
Well, seriously, how old were you then?
Early 90s? I got to do a little math there, but I was in the about 50-ish, yeah, somewhere in there.
Seriously, though, so what were you doing at the time? I was in middle school, and by that point, you'd already been to Indy. You were about to become a factory driver from Ferrari and BMW, right?
Yeah, so that was, I'm going to say that was sort of the middle of my sports car career, sort of the end of my, I jokingly say IndyCar career, because I'm not sure I really had an IndyCar career, but I drove Indy cars for a few years. And then, but as I moved into sports cars, that's about the time that the McLaren F1 came along. And, my eyes lit up when the first time I saw it, because some of that, again, going back older, a car that had a big impact on me as a kid was the Ford GT, the GT40 that raced at Le Mans. Yeah. And when I saw the McLaren F1, I kept going, oh, this is like the new version of the GT40. And, you could kind of go, Ford in the 60s went, no budget. Yeah. Guys, whatever it takes, build a car to win Le Mans, beat Ferrari. And that's a little bit what I think the McLaren F1 was at that time. So that's why it caught my attention.
Well, so back up, right? So what's really interesting about this to me is the stuff that dents us and when it dents us and why. Because there's this whole impressionable period in everybody's life, somewhere between the age of 8 and 18. You have these 10 years where you're forming this impression, this building the language in your head that describes how the world works. And the little landmarks that hit you that, I can remember the first time I went to a racetrack, first time I went to a general aviation airport, first time I did 1,000 things. And all these things stuck with me and helped shape how I see the world, right? So why, let's back up. Let's go all the way back to the GT40. So that's late 60s. Ford decides it wants to go win Le Mans, mainly because Hank the Deuce at Ford, the guy who ran the company, got kind of given the middle finger by Ferrari and says, screw it, we're going to take the guy down. They throw all the money in the world at a program to go dominate Le Mans and do it. And then when they're done, they dust their hands of it, wash things, walk away. Why, as a kid, why did that hit you? What was it about that button that hit you?
Thinking about it, there's a part of it, I think, that is you look at a car and you go, oh, performance. It does something. But it also looks right. There have been some cars that have been really successful or performed at a high level, but they just didn't look right. And the thing about the Ford GT40 is it looked right. The McLaren F1, it looked right. I can think of some other cars, the best example of a car that, had some performance capabilities was the Delta Wing, that elongated, flattened tricycle-looking sports car that raced in IMSA and some at Le Mans and stuff like that. It was revolutionary, but it just didn't look right. Right. And I think part of what makes a car stick with people is certainly, I mean, it's that shape. For me as a kid, the Ford GT40, the Lotus Europa, and a Lotus Elan. I mean, it just, those cars looked right. And uh, you think about cars that Colin Chapman designed. Here was a guy who didn't follow the rules. He just went and did things, and he made cars that were revolutionary, but they also looked right. Tell me that a Lotus 49 or a 72 or the 77, 78. I mean, those Lotus Formula One cars, tell me that they didn't look beautiful as well. They were revolutionary in the change of the shape, but they looked right.
So that's interesting, right? So Chapman founded Lotus, right? And for several decades, all Lotus did was look at the way people had built cars, look at the way engineers had drawn up racing cars, look at the way the world worked. And Chapman's whole thing was that's fine, but what if we did this? What if we did that? And then the guy was famously so much of a squirrel that he didn't, he'd commit to an idea, get it about 80 or 90% of the way there, and then never finish it. Meaning, and in race car terms, that means you don't develop the thing. Whatever you're working on at the time, you end up kind of sort of being drawn by. He would, I guess. And this is common to some engineers I've known, but most people seem to realize that it's not practical because you don't end up making a fully resolved thing, right? But Chapman would get like 80% of the way there, and then he'd come up with a better idea for something else, and then famously just drop what he was doing, drop the old idea, and move on. But that notion of looking right, and it's interesting that we're all drawn to these moments of revolution where this stuff we know, somebody introduces, just dumps smack from outer space, lands on the table, and you look at it, and whatever that new thing is, it carries just enough of the old to be familiar and hit the right buttons in you emotionally, and yet just enough of I've never seen that before to mean something. We've talked about this before, and we've actually taped a little bit on it before for other purposes, but you and I have both driven a McLaren F1. And
yeah.
That's weird, right? Because have you driven a GT40? I haven't. I sat in one once, but have you met that thing from your childhood?
I have driven a GT40 as well. Not enough. Just like I would say I've driven a McLaren F1. Not enough.
Yeah, phones are operators are standing by. Call if you want to make that happen for Ross. Ross is here and willing to help.
Yes.
So So teenage Ross looks at the GT40 and sees something, and then grown up Ross meets the GT40, and it's what, right? How did that hit you as an adult?
So I was at the time in '98. I was driving for BMW in what was sort of the Grand Am / IMSA series at that time. There were two different series. I was driving for BMW. Myself and Bill Oberlin were asked to go to the Pittsburgh Vintage Grand Prix, where BMW was the feature mark. And BMW brought all these cool, historic cars that were either BMW or BMW powered, as the McLaren F1 was. Had that beautiful BMW V12 in it. And our job was to do demo laps in these cars. And there were two cars. I mean, I remember walking up and I'm looking at, there's a 2002, and sorry, Sam, but it's a 2002. I love it. It's a cool car. It was part of my youth, but I looked at the 3.0 CSI. I went, oh yes, I want to drive that. And I looked at the McLaren F1 and went, forget everything else. I want to drive that. And, it did, it made all the right sounds. It had all the right feels. It just did everything. The only thing that it didn't do that day for me was allow me to drive it at the limit. This is a vintage race through a park in Pittsburgh where the trees there's a tree and there's a hay bale in front of it. And I'm probably not going to take a chance of wrapping this F1 around one of those things.
So Pittsburgh, right? So it's a vintage race in a park in a city, and you're in a V12 2,400 pound, 630 some odd horse supercar converted for road race duty on slicks. What did you do? How did that work?
There was one time in my life where I went, oh, I wish I had tire warmers. Because I like the idea. I love driving on cold tires because
Yeah.
that's a huge challenge. But that was a moment in time I was like, if we could just put some tire warmers on here now and I could just go and stand on it and throw it around these twisty little bits through this park, that would be way cool. So unfortunately, I had to drive it with a little bit of a little caution, I guess. And but it's funny. I mean, I think I don't remember if this is the car that Gordon Murray was famous for saying, you know, this car or his next car or his latest cars. The only thing that he regretted was he couldn't get the steering of a Lotus Elan. That feel.
Yeah.
You know, I have a Lotus Elan today. I could not. Honestly, there was no complaints that day in that F1. It was so precise. It was so pointy, but not in a bad way. You know, I just turned in the corner and the car would go, even with tires that were not ultimately up to temp. So it did everything that I wanted it to do and made some really cool sounds too. So that's all part of the experience of driving, right? All of those things combined.
Yeah. So what's really cool about that story, about the F1 story for me, is that, you know, Murray set out, he set out to make a feedback fire hose, right? It was supposed to be, he did not build a numbers machine. And if you know the guy, if you've read anything about the guy, you know, this is a dude who has a garage full of small, weird, for a long time, he drove to work in a Bug-Eye Sprite, you know, in a 998cc Austin Healey that's smaller than my desk. Like he all the guy cared about was how a thing feels and what it does for you. And in setting out to build that, he ended up with a machine that was so pure and so simple in so many ways because he just didn't want the stuff that gets in the way. So as a result, like, the car has no ABS, it has no traction control, it doesn't even have power steering, it doesn't have, you know, none of the things. Like, you could buy luxury cars that had driver aids that were more complicated at the time that made a fraction of the power. And so the steering geometry is, you know, you're right, that was it's in the books. He famously wanted it to be as good as an Elan, which is this wonderful, tiny, small, delicate thing with fingertip steering. And you roll over a quarter, you know which way Washington's head is pointing, right? Like, and it's still so good. These giant fat tires, you know, they're way the hell out there, and the relatively small wheel, and it's just light and delicate and easy. And even on big springs and big tires and GTR trim, the race trim, it was still really, really good. That to me is the thing, right?
And I think you point out what he drove and what he loved, and it was efficiency.
Yeah.
It wasn't, you know, let's put, at that time, this would have been, nowadays it doesn't seem like that, but it's so big a deal. But, you know, he didn't say, oh, let's put a 2,000 horsepower engine in this thing. No, it was like, get the right balance between weight, grip, braking, power, all of those things. And nothing seemed unbalanced. If that meant, like, I've driven cars where you go, you know, this is an amazing car, but if there was ever a car that had too much power for its grip and everything, this is it. Or, man, this thing's got so much grip and the brakes are so great. If only it had a little bit more power. That car, you could never go, oh, it needs more brakes, it needs more aero, it needs more cornering grip, it needs more power. Everything just was perfect that way. It was perfectly balanced that way. That was my impression after not enough laps. Did I make it clear that I haven't driven it enough?
I don't think so. I think we need to say that again. Everyone needs to figure out a way to get Ross. And, you know, while we're at it, I'll sign up again to drive it again.
Because you drove it too.
I did. I drove that exact car, like literally the same tub you drove.
Weird.
The same livery with the same motor, the same gearbox. I sat in the same seat. I just did it. Well, that's, almost 20 years later. So while I was at Road and Track, I was at Road and Track for about 8 years, did a lot of track tests, did a lot of other things. But one of the things we did there, we put together a twin test with that car, which is still owned by BMW North America. It's part of their historic fleet. They have a decent size historic fleet of race cars that lives in Ohio at the Ray Hall Letterman shop, which was an IndyCar team and now does other things and yada, yada, yada. But, wait, is RLL still IndyCar?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
God, forgive me.
They're everything.
So they maintain the thing, and the great thing about the F1 is that there's relatively little to do to it. You know, the motor that's in it, that big BMW V12. It's a cool story in itself, right? So toward the end of development, or toward the end of early development of the F1, Murray, the guy who had put together the thing, he had weight targets, he had horsepower targets, he wanted X and Y and Z, he wanted it to sound a certain way, and he'd been working with McLaren's Formula One partner at the time, which is Honda, to try and reach a deal to spit out an engine for it. And that kind of fell apart at the 11th hour. And so he calls up BMW, who had a good relationship. He had a good relationship with a guy named Paul Rocha, who did, you know, the motorsport engines for the company for a long, long time. His nickname was Camshaft Paul. He was this really interesting dude. But he basically says, we need this much, and it needs to weigh this much, and it needs to spin this much, and what can you do? And Rosa's like, yeah, it's no problem. And I don't know why for a second he sounds Russian, but they spit out this engine. He basically had less than a year to do it, and 9 months later spits out this engine that makes, like I said, 627 horse, comes in a few pounds over the weight target that Murray had asked for. So in trade, Rocha always said, he famously was like, well, I figured he wouldn't care if we gave him more horsepower, but I felt bad about it. So they gave him more horsepower than he asked for. And this thing that they spit out, you know, it had these great big intake tubes that ran off throttles in the middle of the V that went over your head. There's F1s have this roof duct right behind the windshield that you can see. It's relatively short as roof ducts go. It's a big intake, but it means that when you're in the car, that giant carbon airbox and its big snout goes right over your head, and it's right behind you, because the F1 is a center seater, because Murray felt that was pure, and like Formula One. So it's got a seat on each side, and you're sitting there, and the airbox goes over your head. And every time you toe into the throttle, you get 12 throttles and 12 pistons and that big whoop, intake honk right over your head. And you hear it through earplugs, you hear it through a helmet, you could hear it through a tomb. And every time you do it, it's this big wake up, shocking, just this old school V12 wail. And it's, I don't know, you mentioned Oberlin. The test that we did had that car, the GTR, and a McLaren Senna, and Oberlin came along. And he's still, he was a pro then, he's a pro now, he's still driving. He's one of the most successful sports car drivers in American history, drives for BMW. And, he briefly drove GTRs, drove the race version of the F1 in endurance races. Specifically, I believe he went to Le Mans in it. And I talked to him about it, and he was like, the thing about that car, like it all of the stuff that made it a great road car, I mean, it ended up being a pretty good race car, not a great race car, but a pretty decent one. But the stuff that made it a great road car just made it so much fun to race. And I said, well, what do you mean? He goes, man, you left the pits in that thing, and the moment you towed into it on hot tires, you felt taller, you felt better looking. I had more hair, like everything was going to work out. My life was perfect. And it was all the noise and the sensation and the feedback, right? And we could talk in a bit about like my seat time in it. But what hit me that whole time, that entire time we were at that test, it was 2 days, we were pit race outside of Pittsburgh, this wonderful rolling road course in the hills. And all I kept thinking was that 14-year-old me would have been losing his mind.
Yeah.
And to get back to what we were talking about earlier. So you've driven that car when you were 14 or when you were a kid, the GT40. You drove one of those, right?
Yeah.
What was that? Yeah. What did that do to you? Did you care? Did it mean something? How did it work?
So I have this weird relationship with cars. I'm one of those kids that, I popped out of the womb going, oh, car, like that means something to me. And, I have friends who have kids one kid loves cars, can name every driver on the Formula One grid. Another kid could care less. And, so kind of going back to something you were saying earlier, I've spent probably the last 10 years walking around asking people, why? Like, what was it that triggered it for you? And for sure, the GT40 triggered it for me. It was one of those big things. So finally getting to drive one, I would say it was a brute of a car.
Yeah.
In many ways. I mean, it did a lot of things really well. When I drove it, I'm going to say it was a very old car at that point.
Yeah.
And so there was a moment there where I'm kind of like, yeah, I get this. This was a brute, and it's not very modern. It's not very well, it's not precise. It's not efficient. All those kinds of things. It just did it through brute force. But what it did through brute force was unbelievable. Like, you took off and you talk about the sound out of the BMW V12. That 427 Ford motor made some really cool sounds as well.
Yeah.
So it did some other thing. But where I was going is I have this weird relationship I then look at it as it's a tool. And is it the tool that I want to be using right now? And, I grew up, my father was a mechanic. I grew up in a shop. He had snap-on tools. When I started buying tools for myself, they were Craftsman.
Yeah.
And I noticed there was a difference between a Craftsman tool and a snap-on tool. So I could appreciate the snap-on tool, but if I needed to get something done and I have my Craftsman tools, I can get it done as well. So I look at a lot of cars I look at them and I go, oh, that is like, I love the styling. I love the way it works. I mean, I love all that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a tool. And I don't want to take anything away from what the F1 or the GT40 or any other car. That's just how my mind works. But I'll look at an F1 and go, that's a really special tool.
That's what they called me in college, a really special tool.
Yeah. For different reasons, was it? Yeah.
I'm changing the subject. No, that's such a racing driver answer, though, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. It's just that's so revealing. Like, and I like my head gets split down the middle, right? I get into a thing and immediately start thinking about how good it is or bad it is at what it's supposed to do. And then there's the voice in the back of my head that switches places with it occasionally and just says, yeah, but look at the neat thing over here and look at how smooth this is and feel the steering and the goofus, which is, probably why I ended up doing the job I did and you ended up doing the job you did and do. But so that's so.
Hey, and back to the GT4, like I can remember reading, this would have been a road and track from, I'm going to say, late 60s, early 70s. And they did an article about the GT40.
Yeah.
And there was like, I don't remember the exact words, but the words were, and I don't know who wrote it, but it said something like, you can tell your friends that you drive a Ford. And, it does, I forget the exact numbers, but, it does 80 miles an hour in first gear. And then you shift to second and you're doing 130. Yeah. And then you shift to third and you're doing 150. And then you go to fourth and you're doing 180. And at that point, people go, you're in a Ford. Okay. But then it talks about, well, then then you shift into fifth and now you're over 200. So that was the thing that when I drove it, it was geared. I don't know if it had Le Mans gears in it, but it was geared very long. Yeah. And that was one of the things that I just remember about the GT40 was rolling off a line and going, am I ever going to need to shift this thing? I could just drive around in first gear forever. Yeah.
So that's that just thinking back about this, right? About the stuff that hits you and why it hits you. So the F1 in the 90s, there was this moment where, it seemed like cars were just perpetually going to get faster. Everything was perpetually going to get lighter and better and stronger. And when you're 12 or 13 or 14, you don't think about the fact that eventually is going to hit a wall. Like that process has an end. There is a tail to it because you end up, on a long enough extension of it, you end up with, you blink and you're at 60 miles an hour and you're pulling 5G in a corner and your heart can't keep up and your head explodes. And every public road that's signed at 90 miles an hour is too slow, right? There is a point of diminishing returns with this stuff. And what the F1 did in period, one of the reasons it stuck in my stupid kind of troglodyte middle school kid brain was that it took all the metrics and threw them out the window, inflated them, and then threw them out the window. And they made 100 of these things. And for years, all we did was read that it was special and valuable and was always going to be that way. And all the road tests and everybody else went nuts over the fact that it was just good. It was fast, but it was good. And those are two totally different things. And we've talked about this a bunch, right? The notion that like it's not the meat, it's the motion. It's not what you're doing, but how you do it, right? A race car that makes you work incredibly hard to get X pace is not as useful a tool as one that makes you work slightly less hard to get to the limit, right?
And one of the things I find interesting in you mentioned that Gordon Murray he went to Honda,
yeah,
and asked them to build a motor,
yeah,
and I can remember reading where he went to Japan and he drove an NSX, and he went, "This is different. This changes. This sets a new bar."
yeah.
And a story for another day, but I drove NSX serial number 2 and 3.
How? When? Wait, really?
1989, just before it was launched. I got hired to drive both cars at a track.
Seriously?
And basically for a promo video. They just like, drive, we're just taking video.
That's cool. I had no idea.
Yeah, I mean, really cool experience, because then, it comes up. And I can remember, because shortly before that, in the months before that, I had driven like the latest Ferrari and the latest Corvette and the latest whatever. And then I drove the NSX and went, oh, this changes everything.
Yeah.
Because it does all those things, but I could drive it to the corner store like I'm driving a Honda Civic. So it just, to your point, it got the performance without having to work as hard. And not that driving shouldn't have to take some effort,
right,
but it was a change. It was I think if you look at the history of automobiles, there are certain cars that came along that went, oh, everything just took a step up from this point on.
Right.
And I'm going to say the GT40 did that. Because I'm biased here, I'm going to say things like the Lotus Elan in the 60s, many Lotuses in the 60s and early 70s and stuff like that, changed everything. I mean, if you look at the history of Formula One through the 60s, late 50s, 60s into the 70s, what Lotus did was every few years, there was a complete change.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that makes the McLaren F1 stand out, because it was a major step forward in so many areas, from how it looked, how it made you feel, how it sounded, how it drove, how the steering felt, all of those things. It made it took automotive development, design, history, and it just took a big, massive step. And one could argue that we're waiting for that next step to come along. And maybe I think, I guess in the history of the automobile, the electric car and all these other things are doing that, but maybe for a different reason.
Well, when you think about it, right? I mean, that's both inevitable and disappointing, and also kind of cool and also kind of not, right? Because that curve of evolution, anything that ages, anything that we develop and work on and poke at, is the learning curve, the angle of that curve of improvement is always going to be steepest early on. And you look at how the automobile evolved. You look at the first 20 or 30 years, and there were these great big leaps seemingly every 5 minutes. And then by the middle of the last century, it was like, every so often we'd get a great big motion. There was just, those were still happening. They just weren't as frequent. And then by the tail end of the 20th century, there were certain things that we had accepted. And one of them was that supercars are just going to be finicky. The Italian stuff is going to be built like cheese and fall apart. The Japanese, well, they don't make them yet. So, that's not a thing apparently. And the American stuff is going to be brutish and fast, but ultimately, require big biceps and punch you in the face every time you try and drive it hard. And yet those two cars, the NSX, the Acura NSX, Acura Honda NSX, and the McLaren F1, there were these resets, there was hard resets in how the business worked, and more important, how we thought about what speed was supposed to be, what it took out of you, right? The NSX was famously quiet, reliable. It felt like an Acura Legend, and they're great for it. They're great cars. And the F1 was this involving, evocative, kind of razor's edge thing that was deeply reliable and massively fast and didn't ask anything of you, and was a feedback fire hose. And, at the time, the only people who'd managed that were, there'd been some things out of Germany and some things out of America, but they all came with a stereotype. And the only people who'd really nailed that were the Italians, and all the Italian stuff was fragile and weird and, caught fire. And I mean, think about what Ferrari made in that period, the F40, the 348, these things that are, some of the welds look like they were done by a blind cat. I mean, so much of this stuff is so hard to stereotype. And all of a sudden you have this boom, hard reset. And even at 13, for 13, 14, whatever it was 94 or 95 when they won Le Mans, right? It was 14. When the McLaren won Le Mans, that's a thing. You latch onto that, and everyone went ape for it, and that just lodges it in even harder. I keep wanting to talk about, Mike's going to kill me. Mike, our producer, is going to kill me, but I keep wanting to talk about driving the thing. But there's so much about what it means that hits me,
I was going to ask you because I want to know, I want to hear you because although my mind's still stuck with blind cat welding right at the moment, but I
mean, I could have just said me. You haven't seen me weld, Ross. My welds
are
awful.
Okay. So what was your impressions? Like, give me an impression.
Okay, so it's forgive me because it's hard to do this without just kind of like turning on the verbal brain dump because there's just so much, right? So what is Mike holding up? What does it say? How did it make you feel? He held a phone up to the screen, said, how did it make you feel? How did it make me feel? It made me feel like the world was going to be okay. It made me feel like I was a million feet tall. So the garages at Pit Race there's a bunch of them, and they're low, they have small doors, they're fairly dark. And the PR guy, lovely man named Tom, who was working for BMW then, still works for BMW now, was kind enough. We had worked with him on some stories before and on getting into a lot of their historic collection because they have it. They're one of the few manufacturers, BMW is, that has a fleet of stuff that they maintain and use. And they trot it out, to Monterey and all kinds of other historic events. But he walked me over, and we're in this kind of dark room, and it's sitting there with the wheels off and the doors up, and there's a battery tender on it. And I remember looking down at the battery tender thinking, oh yeah, it's a battery tender. It's not made of gold or, titanium, or it's just a regular battery tender because it's just a car. Except it wasn't just a car. He spent probably 3 or 4 minutes talking to me, teaching me how to get in and out of the thing. So the seat's in the middle, right? The road car McLaren F1 has a seat on each side of the driver, set back a couple of feet. The race car, there's just carbon buckets right behind it. There's a seat in the middle, and then there's these big carbon holes in the back. And that particular car has had harnesses fitted in one of them so they can take passengers around. I've ridden in there. We'll get to that in a second because I have a good story on that one. But you basically just have to crawl over those holes and cram yourself in, and the shift lever's on the right, so you can only come in from the left effectively, and there's a tunnel with the shift lever. And so he walked me through getting into the thing, and I get into it and out of it. And it's like, you put your ass here and you lift your legs, and you go over and in and out, and then you're in it. And all of a sudden you're just in it, sitting there, surrounded by the thing. And it's like you're a million miles from the door and a million miles from the real world and a million miles from anything like a normal car, except then you look out over the dash and it's just car. And I remember I fired it for the first time and pulled out of the garage, and I had my kit on, had suit, boots, and helmet and Hans, and was buckled up and was going out. I did two sessions, one session, I don't remember. And driving through the paddock, it was just like, the clutch was easy, and the steering was easy, and it just kind of clunked into gear. And I had driven an F1 before. I drove one in traffic. I actually drove the first serial number, not the first production, but car 001 in Chicago traffic for a shoot for RNT, 10 years ago at this point. And it was terrifying because you're in Chicago traffic in a car at that time that we had insured for like $11 million. Had to go back and forth with all the people in New York about the insurance papers and surrounded by other cars. And all I'm thinking is, well, this is the worst thing I could have done with this. And yet it was where they offered to let us drive it. So we did it. We shot it. And pulling out of that garage at Pittsburgh, it was the same thing. The steering was light. The gearbox was, the quicker you move the lever, it has these big high effort synchros. But if you try and be gentle with it, how like a Hewland or a dog box in a race car, it needs one touch. It needs quick, and then it just goes flick in. This thing, if you tried to be gentle with it, the synchros fought you and the linkage fought you. So you had to just go boom, 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 quick. And then everything slicked up and worked. And I just remember looking around going, I don't know how I'm here. And also just shocked that it felt like a car, which sounds like the dumbest thing in the world to say, but had this long travel throttle and the steering was easy and fingertip and buttery. But it was a GTR. That tub went to Le Mans. They ran at Le Mans in 95, 6. Like it just, man, I need to pause now because I've been talking for too long and Ross hasn't said anything, but like we haven't even gotten onto the racetrack. And all I sat there thinking was, I don't know what to do with this. And I'm a person who, there's perpetually 400 voices going in my head at once and all of them shut down. And it wasn't because it was fast car. I'd driven a lot of fast stuff. It wasn't because it was race car, prototype, or any of it. I have a lot of time in that stuff. Not good, but it was time. What hit me was the fact that I couldn't stop thinking about it the way I saw it when I was 14. And it was just this brain wallop. It shut all those voices down. It's just silence. I don't think I've ever felt that calm in a car ever. It was remarkable.
And I was going to ask that question, like, how old were you at the time when you were driving this?
Oh, so this would have been, I've actually got the story up on another screen. Let me see, man, 2019. So yeah, I would have been 38.
So because when I drove the GT40,
yeah,
there was a little brief moment where I felt like I was kind of gone back in time. I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether you kind of had that same experience.
I did. But those moments were all standing in the garage where, you see bits and pieces. I don't know if this happened to you, but I see bits and pieces of things that remind me of parts of my childhood. Like, a book, or I eat a particular food that my mom made, or I drive down a certain street in the town I grew up. And there's this instant light switch flood of memories. And I didn't get that at the wheel because 14-year-old Sam didn't know his took us from a hole in the ground. He certainly didn't know what an F1 GTR felt like. But I got it staring at it because, man, there was a test in Road and Track. I think it was Egan that wrote it. There were gray marketed cars that came in through a company called Ameritech. And the first test that Road and Track did in the United States was through an Ameritech converted McLaren F1. And making the F1 legal for the United States at that point meant replacing those gorgeous, covered headlamps with these big, ugly, exposed reflector things and putting terrible little, slow impact bumpers on it, and which naturally everybody took off the moment they got the car home. But I remember reading that, and I must have read it. The issue showed up, and I must have read it 300 times that first week, and just staring at it, hit the same button. But that was all in the garage. The car, we talked the other day about how you turn off the things in your head that don't help you perform in a certain way. And that was the weirdest thing. I didn't have to do it. It's just, I pulled onto the track. We sat for a moment in the hot pits. And I talked to our photographer, and then I just went out, and I think I did 7, 10, 12 laps, something like that, and slowly ratcheted up speed. And, that was, it suddenly just became just another car. Because if you don't, there's that whole thing where when you're in a car like that, if you don't think about it as just another car, then you're being unsafe. You're going to end up in the weeds. You're going to, outthink yourself. You'd make stupid mistakes you would make anyway, that kind of stuff. Right. But
yeah. And I think that's I don't know, maybe that's the driver in us, because if you don't turn that off, you're going to hurt something. And, at that point, when you're rolling down pit lane, or where you're rolling through the paddock or whatever, you can kind of go, wow, this is pretty cool.
Yeah.
But once you're on the track, it's a tool.
Yeah.
And, whether it's a Craftsman or a Snap-on, that's what you've got to work with right now. And I'm going to say it is, I got to go and do Performance Car of the Year Road and Track with you.
That's right.
A few years ago. And I was shocked and amazed and disappointed at how good people like you are at getting out of a car and then describing it. I get out of the car and go, yeah, that's a tool. I used it. Okay, move on. What's the next one? And that's sort of been, now afterwards, I can remember even at that Performance Car of the Year event, standing back and going, wow, I just drove that and that and that. Whoa, that was really cool. That one made me feel really cool. Like that's the car I want to get back into right now.
Yeah.
And that's the way I felt after driving the F1. It was, how do I find a way to get back into that? And did I mention that if anybody's listening to this and they've got an F1 and they want to invite me to come and drive
it? Do you want to drive a McLaren F1 again? I feel like we haven't talked about this. How does this work?
Not enough. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so, yeah. Okay. So what other, and there's actually, I actually have an oddball story. So that exact car, cause it's that GTR, cause it's been in BMW's fleet for a long time. Fun side rail. After the race, so that car was sponsored by BMW North America at Le Mans. And after the race, BMW, I don't remember whether it was shortly after or several years after, but BMW Germany basically called North America and said, all right, it's done. Sure, I guess keep the car fine. And then they had money. They needed money a short while later. And one of the executives told the guy managing the collection to sell it and take the money and use it to basically fund the rest of the company, because we don't need at least $1 million. As time went on, it would become more, sitting there on the floor. And the guy was like, sure, I'll do it. Yes, I'm going to sell it. And then, would kind of sort of try to sell it, but not really. And then it stuck around. But the point was that car has been there for a long time. And several years before, I actually had this weird moment of, I got to ride in it when somebody crashed it at 130 miles an hour. I was passenger seat.
You were in the car when it crashed?
Yes.
Oh, that's even better.
It was, but the point is, I had that moment at the wheel where I was like, oh yeah, just a car. And then I had that moment in it while somebody else was just a carring it, sitting there thinking, what is all of this? The history, the flood of the feelings and all the things. And then we were literally spinning backwards through an advertising bollard on the exit road, on pit exit road at Laguna, heading into turn 1. And we ended up buried up to the gravel, up to the rockers in pea gravel. So this front street at Laguna, right? As it goes over the hill where it bends to the left. Right as the car unloads at the top. The guy, I won't name the name because he's a very nice guy and a very accomplished driver, but I've been did an oral history for Road and Track on the 70th anniversary of the McLaren F1. Talked to dozens of people, took months to put together, and was one of the things, Tom, the PR guy, was like, well, we would love to have you ride in the thing if you'd like, and kind of form background for it. I was like, yes, who says no to that? And got in it, and we did a lap to warm the tires, and it takes a long time. These big fat Michelin slicks, a long time to get heat in them, and we come down the front straight, and I'm looking at the dash because you ride passenger race car, you watch the numbers, you want to know what you're doing, and it was right, like the dash crested a $135 or 38 or whatever it was. Might have been 140, right as we went over that unload in the front straight, and the back started to move. And I thought, oh, he's going to catch it. And then it moved quicker, and we pirouetted to the left and probably did 2 revolutions, I guess, and slowed enough speed. We went like clear through. They had these advertising, not bollards, but advertising like sandwich boards next to the entrance road. And we went clear through one of them, blew it to pieces, clear through the second one, blew it to pieces, and then went backward off the track in, I guess they call it Andretti. So it's in 2 in that, that left-hander, that double apex left-hander, backward off the track. And as the car came to a stop, the guy switched it off and buried in the gravel, and the door wouldn't open because the gravel was, the doors on the McLaren go up as they go out. So the door wouldn't open. We're sitting there for a second, and the driver, I'm to the side of the driver. I guess it would have been to the left, maybe. I don't remember where the passenger seat, whether it was left or right. But the driver looks at me, and I can see out the window, the corner worker running over, just jogging over. And then she kind of tries to open the door, and she can't get it. So she starts scooping gravel away, and there's a brief moment of silence. And the driver looks at me and he goes, yeah, don't write about that. It's just like, okay, cool. But
so you never wrote about it?
I never wrote, actually.
But I
did write about it. I didn't name names.
Oh, okay.
But now, point is, God, what were we talking about? Man, ADHD squirrel. Where were we, Ross? What were we? Mike, remind me. Where were we?
I'm going to, I mean, so what was it like? I mean, so did you get going again? That's the big question.
No,
I've got.
They parked it because it had broken.
Oh, that was it?
Carbon. Yeah, that was it. So I got, I got a lap and a half of riding. But, we were talking about driving it. Shit. we should probably go back to the subject. Long story short, I drove the thing. And so that car, as you know, is one of the like 28 they built, one of the 28 GTRs. And there were, at that point in history, the GTR was just a kind of mildly tweaked version of the road car for a bunch of reasons we don't need to get into, but that I could talk for hours on end because I'm a dork. But I just remember pulling out into that first lap and thinking, okay, don't do anything stupid. And towing into it, hearing the noise, just this building swelling, just whop up top in that giant carbon duct, and looking out and thinking, man, I wonder if I'm gonna. No, there's an apex. No, okay, well, it doesn't matter that the fenders are out there and you're in the middle. Nothing looks different. And wow, the brakes feel great. There's this long travel, but really modulatable pedal, and it just rips through shifts, just crack through it. Like when you get it right, the flywheel on that motor is just basically two period E36 M3 road car, BMW, European spec, 6 cylinders, straight sixes, joined at the hip. And you'd think, okay, well, it's a big V12. There's a lot of mass moving, but it's got the clutch pack and the flywheel on it are the size, they're basically no larger than your neck. And so there's no rotating mass to it. And there is, but when you hit it, it just, every downshift, just this massive light made of air, whap, 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 whap. You get the shift timing right and you could just crack through it. And it makes you feel like the biggest, most impressive, most professional man who's ever professionaled a thing. And, at one point I just kept driving it. And there were moments where I just kept putting more pace into it. And like, it was probably, a test like that. We had so Oberlin was there. He was doing laps for us in data in that and in a McLaren Senna, which at the time was brand new, had active aero in it, was on our compound tires, so a road tire, but with trackability underneath it. And the McLaren was on slicks. And in the end, it ended up being relatively close. They were a couple of seconds apart, but like exit speed and mid corner speed was remarkably similar. But Bill did a 9.5 tenths lap, and when you do tests like that as at a car magazine, unless you're going for time, you just go out there and do 85%, 90%, maybe 95%. And I slowly ratcheted up to about 90%. And then, there were places like there's a fast, I think it's a right-hander into braking at pit that the car might have been, $150, $160. And I backed off. And there were places I took it easy, but on purpose because it was worth $20 million. And I don't have $20 million. But so here's the thing, Ross. I know that my dress and my general appearance suggests that I'm a man of immense wealth, but I had to
with your words.
I had to sell all of my submarines last year. We had a rough spot. I've only got one 747 left, man. It's difficult.
Wow, tough life.
But the whole point of this very long and rambling story is I kept thinking, well, this is just a car, not going to do what you do in a normal test like this, not going to drive a little different and see what happens. Try this, make a mistake on purpose and see what happens. See how forgiving the thing is. And then I started doing that stuff just by kind of brain fart, because that's what you do. And, it just was a car. It was forgiving and so docile. And at one point I was like, I wonder if it put it up on the curb. And I put it up on the curb at like 80, 90 miles an hour, and it went loose and it kicked loose and I caught it. And it was just this little boop, boop, and grabbed a gear and we went down the hill. And I heard later that Tom, the PR guy, was standing in the starter stand with one of the other guys from R&T, my friend Travis. And he apparently Tom just saw it and just rolled his eyes and went, Sam, and just like, deep sigh. And I've got video of it. In that moment, I'm like, I did the same thing where I was like, in my head, I do the same thing I do every time I watch the video of that. I'm like, I slid a McLaren F1. I'm a giant dork. Look at me. And it was that happened. I'm like, oh, cool car. And then I backed off after that and drove down the back straight, literally, because all I wanted to do was say that over and over in my head. I just did that in a McLaren F1. Because 14-year-old me was deep down in the Sam brain, losing his mind. Yeah. And that stuff, how that stuff is tied to how we think is just nuts, right? It was such a day. Holy shit.
So as you were telling that story, my mind drifted off in a different direction.
Most people do when they listen to me. It's fine.
I'm sorry, but and I don't want this to be a downer.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about these cars that changed our world.
Yeah.
And obviously this F1 was one of those ones. And like we talked about the NSX and GT40s and, all sorts of things. And you told the story at the very beginning about McLaren starting with Bruce McLaren.
Yeah.
And him building his own cars. And, we've talked about Colin Chapman building Lotuses. And, you get a guy like Gordon Murray building this F1 car, and it changes our world. And I think today about how cars are made now.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, are we going to see that again? Because I mean, we can look at F1 and we can go, Adrian Newey is still making a difference.
Yeah.
At Red Bull.
Right.
But the other teams, they're all committees and design groups and so are we going to see another F1?
That's an interesting question, right? And that's a thing we could talk for another hour about, but nobody needs to hear that. The thing that I get stuck on, I'm of two minds, right? Because at every moment in history, somebody has griped about the new and said things were better 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
People thought radio was going to kill theater. People thought movies were going to kill radio. People thought television was going to kill movies. People thought the internet was going to kill television. Like everybody at some juncture in history can point to the past and say, that was better. We're not going back again. We lost something. And the truth is that it's never that simple, right? It's always, there are special moments and those moments can't be recreated. But what I get stuck on with this is that's the pinnacle and the peak of the way we thought about cars in the 20th century. And the numbers thing is part of it, right? Because 10 years later, F1 was the fastest car in the world for basically a decade. Nobody did anything that got close. And the only thing that kicked it off the stage was the Bugatti Veyron, which is the exact opposite. It is a numbers heavy, technology heavy, driver aid heavy, purely designed to spit performance machine. And you drive a Veyron and they got better. They evolved it. They put more feedback into it. The steering got better. The seat of your pants spine feel, as the car builds into the tire, got better. But it's still a big, heavy, kind of numb, kind of distant thing that has one job. And that job is, basically to make the guy who headed Volkswagen at the time happy, because he said, we're going to build this insane thing. And everybody else went, you're insane. But the big job for the thing was to blow people's minds with numbers. And it did that. McLaren did it as a byproduct of being this innately satisfying thing designed by a guy who liked satisfying things. And that's, will we see another F1? No. Will we see other moments like that where some genius has that random Venn overlap of opportunity and funding and market and availability and history and time that all comes together at the right moment? Yeah. And
so you're talking the Tesla pickup truck.
Oh, sure, totally. It is the Cybertruck. It's happening.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, right? It's never, will we see another one of those? No, we'll see something different, not better or worse, just the same ideas applied differently, I think. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before,
I think the difference, correct me if I'm wrong, but guys like Gordon Murray cared about the driving experience.
Yeah.
And, there are companies that tell you they do. Mm-hmm. For a long time they have. But now they've got these design departments that are, I guess they're trying to make the driver matter. They're trying to make the driving experience matter, but it just seems slightly disconnected. When you had, and maybe today, one person, and not that Gordon Murray, drew every single component on that car, but he had his fingers on everything, right?
Yeah.
He designed it, and I'm not sure that can happen now, and that concerns me a little bit. Even today, how much of a Red Bull Formula One car is Adrian Newey actually designing? I think it's a conceptual thing.
Is it? So that's the other question, right? Our culture makes a big deal, rightfully so, about the solitary genius, laboring away in a cave and producing a thing of wonders. And that's That's real. And yet, the evolutionary arc of the automobile is that we have this thing that needs to every year get faster, safer, stronger, better, cleaner. And the machine just gets more and more complicated. And even a simple thing like a racing car is in no way a simple thing anymore. And for better and worse, right? You could argue positive and negative, but is it important? And that's a whole other show. Is it important to have a single genius at the middle of something getting everything he wants? Like,
I don't think so. But what is important to me is the driving experience.
Right.
And whether that is done by a committee or one individual, I don't really care.
Yeah.
Like if I walked up to Gordon Murray today, I'd go, hey, thanks. Like that was an amazing experience. But I don't really care about you. But don't take that the wrong way there, Gordon, if you're listening to this. I'm sure he is.
He's a hero. I hope he's not listening to this because he just listened to me ramble and talk all over you for an hour. But yeah, I mean, to kind of close things out, right? So what's really interesting about the modern car market, about the way fast cars work in general, is that for so long that the performance was a byproduct, and the performance was important, but the feedback was a byproduct of it, right? You couldn't get one without the other in a lot of ways. And we chased one and got the other. And then the people who focused on feedback got cars that were more satisfying to drive and faster. And, there's just more layers between driver and tire now. And that's not gonna change in so many ways unless we start changing how we look at the automobile. New cars are just that they tell you less. You get used to driving more with your eyes and your spine than with the stuff that, kind of reaches in and scratches your spleen. And that's there are far fewer cars now that are great. And I mean unadulterated great than there were 15, 20 years ago when I started doing this. And that's, that doesn't mean the good ones aren't great. That just means that the great ones are a smaller percentage. And it's all tied in, right?
Well, being an optimistic, hopeful person, I also then my mind just went, you know what? One person can make a difference. If you look at what Ford is doing with this Mustang, and what the CEO of Ford is saying, go do this, guys.
Yeah.
Is he designing it? No, but he's making a difference. Yeah. So maybe one person can make a difference. That's cool.
Yeah. And you see it all over the business, right? The Toyota GR Corolla solely exists because Akio Toyota is a freak for that kind of stuff, and he loves it. And that's great.
Yeah,
it matters. I think on that note, I mean, the thing to probably tie a bow on it is, is there stuff that's hurting the brains of 14-year-olds everywhere? And it's out there. We probably won't know exactly how much it dented people for another 10 or 20 years, but it's always fun to think about the why, right?
Yep. And I have a mid-teen that lives down the street from me and with Subarus all over the place.
Yeah.
And he loves to come to the garage and talk about my Lotus and stuff like that. So, when people say young people don't care about cars anymore, yes, they do.
Oh yeah. That's bunk. They do.
Yeah.
You're just not looking in the right places.
Guarantee you that take a photo of a McLaren F1 and put it in front of a 14-year-old today, and there's a good percentage of them that are like, oh, can I have a poster of that? Maybe not a poster, but I want it on my phone or something. So
I'll bookend this with one last short story. I promise it'll be short. The PR guy for BMW, Tom, I saw him this past summer at Elkhart Lake at the vintage races there. It's a big vintage race there that used to be called the Chicago Vintage Races. It's had a bunch of names since, but BMW brought a transporter full of stuff. And in that transporter was that F1. And I walked by and I'm like, oh, cool, an F1. And I'm such a jaded idiot that I walked by and I'm like, oh yeah, F1. And I kept walking and then I stopped. I'm like, wait, that was the car. And I turned around and it's there. And I ended up talking to Tom. I stared at it for a couple of minutes. It was kind of hard to get to because there were people glommed around it. But I talked to Tom for a bit and I was like, has it been this crowded all weekend? Have people just been walking up to me? He's like, yeah, no one really, it's not that they don't care about the other stuff we bring. They want to see that everywhere we bring it. We pull it out of the trailer, we dump it on the pavement, and people it's a magnet. which I guess is, and it was all ages, right? It wasn't just kids. It's good story is a good story, right?
Well, if we can ever come up with the answer of why some people are attracted to those things, I think we can use that to our advantage. And that would be your 20 million right there.
If that's how I take over the world, I think I'd be okay with it. If Sam becomes king of the world because something McLaren F1, then I die happy. Why not? But
and you win.